Everybody, Cybertao back with you. We're finishing up our review of how to handle hanging pawns. Today we're going to look at one example of how to sort of more of a pure kingside attack approach. So the d-pawn break, in my opinion, is the heart of what makes the hanging pawns work. It's the break you always want to be on the lookout for. But there are also some situations where it's more of a pure caveman kingside attack approach, where pawn breaks or moving the hanging pawns at all really doesn't enter into the equation. And it's vital to have those patterns in your mental database as well to effectively play the structures. So this is a classic example that goes back to the days of Botvinnik. This is a game between Philip Schlosser against Schlosser-Tischbierek. This is a 2018 game. Schlosser played c4, d5, d4. This is exchange. So this is semi-Tarrasch. So black is avoiding the main slog, ex-d5, the exchange, Queen's Gambit exchange variation. This has attracted all manner of players on the spectrum to white's side. This was a favorite of Samuel Reshevsky, who was a sort of feared stoic positional grinder, but it was also a favorite of Garry Kasparov, who was, in my opinion, the greatest attacking player of all time. And there's a wide variety of ways to interpret this position as well. So c6. e3, bishop e7. Of course, I want to turn this into opening theory symposium, but bishop f5 is a way to make this boring. But bishop e7 is a classical way. Queen c2, and this is a key fork for white. So knight f3 would be more the Samuel Reshevsky approach. This would be the positional grinder approach. Knight ge2, this would be the Garry Kasparov burn down the village approach. This would be the super aggressive approach. White's retaining the option to play f3, and that's the main reason to develop the knight to e2 instead. White retains the ability to play a minority attack, so the positional idea... I'll just put a move on the board. White's main positional idea, especially with the knight on f3, is to play rook a b1 and try to get b4 b5 on the board to attack this pawn on c6 and try to create a weakness on the queen side. Knight g2, though, again, this is an opening theory, I'm just getting the moves on the board. Knight g2 retains the ability for white to play f3, which supports the pawn break e4, and this is much more aggressive for white than the knight f3 approach. That's why a lot of black players, they won't go into the Queen's Gambit declined unless white's committed to knight f3. So that's why a lot of white players, or black players, they won't play that d5 unless they see knight f3 on the board. And then that avoids the super aggressive knight ge2 Queen's Gambit exchange variation. It's largely a matter of taste, but I will say that the knight ge2 line in the Queen's Gambit exchange, it scores incredibly well, and black's never really found a reliable way to equalize against it. All said, though, Tischbierek avoids this whole kettle of fish by playing knight xd5, which has some plus sides to it, of course. Knight f3, c5, e3. I really like this as white. It avoids the whole hackneyed positional slog that you start to see from e4, because the e4 line, it used to be incredibly dynamic, but it's had a lot of the juice analyzed out of it. There's already two sets of minor pieces off the board, so it's harder for white to whip up something aggressive. A lot of this position largely boils down to the d-pawn break, as we discussed in the last session, and having only one main positional idea, it's harder to make juice from this position. And this is definitely much more of a stoic positional slog than another position might be. e3 is definitely a much more dynamic move, because we're going to head towards an isolated queen pawn position, or hanging pawns as we see. And there's a lot more potential for white to get aggressive play at this. All the minor pieces are going to stay on the board, or at least most of the minor pieces. And that makes it a lot easier for white to whip up some sort of dynamic attack against the king side, or some sort of piece pressure. I quite like this, and this would be the Botvinnik way of playing. He played this system as white quite a bit, and he was the first player to really codify the theory of this and really isolated queen pawns in general. Before Botvinnik, we sort of viewed isolated queen pawns with this sort of mystical fear, this Steinitzian fear of creating a weakness. Botvinnik saw the pluses and minuses and really developed White's aggressive plans and how to play with the isolated queen pawn correctly. So all credit to Patriarch. Knight c6, bishop c4. This is specifically the Botvinnik move order. It's not mandatory, but I also like this quite a bit. It puts immediate pressure on the knight on d5. Bishop d3 is perfectly fine as well. This is just a matter of taste. I personally prefer bishop c4 because it's a little bit more concrete. It puts direct pressure on White's position or Black's position immediately. But just a matter of taste. I mean, certainly the bishop on d3, that's the diagonal it eventually belongs on. So cx d4, knight x3. I don't think it's going too far to say this is an error. It's a popular move, and it's been played quite enough. But I think it clarifies the position way too quickly. Typically, you don't want to be the player making the decisions to clarify things. You don't want to be the one spending the time to take the tension out of the position. You want to be the one forcing your opponent to spend the time to clarify the position. Here, it's reinforcing the pawn on d4, so White no longer has to worry about the d4 pawn being a weakness. It creates hanging pawns, but it's in this specific position, it's hard for Black to really create pressure against the hanging pawns because White is getting pressure so quickly. Standard would be bishop e7, castle, rook e1. Bishop f6, just an aside, I've said this in our isolated queen pawn system. Knight f6 is played here a lot. I really don't like this at all. This is spending another tempo moving the minor piece away from its ideal square. I don't like that at all. Bishop f6 is modern preference, and it would be my choice as Black. You know, the bishop immediately aims itself at d4, so knight b6 is a threat here. If Black needs to play g6 to blunt off the h7 square, that bishop can fill the fiend shadow immediately. This would be a standard isolated queen pawn position. I think knight e4 would be my choice here, if I remember my theory right. I subjectively prefer White. You know, White's going to get the bishop pair here, so I always like the bishop pair. But this is objectively probably equal, and it's going to be a good fight. Knight x c3 just takes the tension out of the position, allows White to build up. Bishop e7, rook e1, that's where the rook belongs in this position, of course, just on the semi-open file. Bishop d3, so now the bishop goes to the diagonal that it ultimately belongs. The white pawn isn't on c4, so we're not really thinking about the d-pawn break here. This is a position where we're thinking solely about king-size exercises. And when you look at Black's mobilization, you know, Black only has 2 of his minor pieces developed. Plus, these minor pieces aren't on the king side. If you shifted this knight from c6 to f6, it would make it more difficult for White to really make progress, because there would be more of defensive bastion on the king side. Here, that bastion doesn't exist. You know, this knight's on c6, this rook's on a8, this bishop's on c8, all far away from the Black king side. So that makes any White attempt to go for an attack more likely to succeed. So bishop e7, and here h4. This used to be considered... Sorry, I popped my ears. This used to be considered sort of a quirky, aggressive pawn sacrifice that may or may not have been correct. We see now with modern theory, this is just the absolute correct move, and White has a humongous advantage here, possibly decisive initiative. In the old days, Botvinnik had this position a few different times. His choice was queen c2, because the idea was, you know, we're forcing that weakness on the king side, so g6 was played in the game. Botvinnik Rogozin. Queen d2, and then now that we force this weakness on the king side, the queen shifts away from the diagonal, and we're looking to take advantage of these dark squares. c8, rook a b1. I personally don't care for that move, but anyways. This was the course of a Botvinnik Rogozin game, where Botvinnik eventually did grind Rogozin down, but I don't necessarily think Rogozin is that much worse here. It's harder for White to take advantage of these dark squares. Plus, Black can eventually try to gain some sort of counterplay on the queen side. He can play knight f5, open up the scope of this bishop with b7. But this is entirely unnecessary. Queen c2, it's not a necessary investment of time. h4, this was initially invented by Razuviev, a very creative Soviet player. This is completely correct. It's not even really a pawn sacrifice, because it's incredibly difficult for black to take that pawn. All we're doing is simply supporting knight g5, and then white just continues to deploy. Queen h5, and just go for broke on the king side. And it's much more likely that this is going to succeed, because none of black's pieces are anywhere close to the black king side. Again, if you shifted this knight over to f6, none of these things are likely going to work, because black has more of a defensive force. Here, white's free to tee off on the king side, because a lot of pieces are isolated from the black king side. So h4, completely correct. This is a move you want to have in your mental database, whether it's a pawn sacrifice or not. Supporting that knight hopping to g5 meshes incredibly well with this bishop on the b1 to h7 diagonal. That h7 point is key for the attack. So h4 is the initial setup for an assault on the black king side. So here it's completely correct. Queen d5, this was initially come up with by Jan Tiemann in a game against Vishwanov and Anand. Black is still much worse, but this is probably the best defensive chance. At least it's trying to generate activity. Just an example of how black just can't take that pawn. He cannot. Rook e3. So again, this is the key rook lift in a lot of hanging pawn positions, especially when that pawn's still in c3 supporting the d-pawn. Just bring the rook over to go after the king side. Here, white has the bishop pair. This bishop's posted beautifully on d3. Just simply rook h3 is threatened with a mating attack after winning that h7 pawn. This is doomed. This is just... I don't even think this is close to being okay for black. This is probably losing. g6 is more or less forced. Black could try to limp on with f5, but that's just... Then black is suffering for no good reason. Black isn't even up material. G6, but then rook g3. So in my opinion, this is better than rook h3, because we're supporting bishop g5, plus the rook is aimed at the black king. So it's a little bit more pointful. Bishop g5, getting the rook with tempo. This is one potential path that we've seen in a few games. Not mandatory, but I think this is white's best path forward. This is just absolutely crushing. This is a massacre. Bishop takes g6 is already threatened. The fact that black is up a pawn is completely irrelevant to the fundamentals of the position. White's just going to continue to batter the black king side. This is close to winning, if not already winning. So queen d5 at least looks for activity. It's trying to create some influence on the long diagonal. But white just simply continues to build his initiative from here. And it's remarkable how it's simple moves that build that initiative. White really doesn't do anything fancy from this point. He just simply mobilizes his pieces and goes after the king side. Sometimes it's that simple. Rook b1, I like this. It creates this clever path for the rook to lift into action. Knight g5 is also fine. Bishop takes, bishop e4, and then bishop 2. I like this dance by the bishop. So hops to h7, force the king to h8, hops to e4, force the queen away, and then back to c2, which is ultimately where we'd like to go with the bishop, because we want to create that mating battery with queen d3. Notice that the knight can't be taken, of course. And that's what the kids call checkmate. But otherwise, white's just going to continue to build. Queen d3. This is a horrible position for black. This is on the verge of losing already. So rook b1. It's not the only move, but I certainly like it. Knight g5 is also valid. Bishop f6. No, the queen really can't take. Rook b2. Knight g5. Bishop takes is sort of forced after h6. White's just battering through. Bishop h7 is one of the threats, followed by knight takes f7. And white just breaks through. So bishop takes. Rook takes g5. So this is a very clever path for the white rook. Rook b1, rook b5, rook takes g5. And then the other rook is still free to lift onto the king side if we need it. F5 is sort of forced in this position to blunt out the light square bishop, but after queen e2, again, the fact that black is up a pawn is irrelevant to the fundamentals of the position. This is just a devastating position for whites. He's got the bishop pair. He's already got this rook in g5, which is an attacking resource you usually don't get in a position like this. White is pretty much winning already. This is a devastating attack. So bishop f6 tries to keep things a little bit more solid. Rook b5. Queen d8, again, if black takes. Actually, bishop b2 is actually strongest here. White has just a simple threat of queen c2, rook a1. So black just can't take that pawn on a2. Rook h5. So again, I love this path for the white rook to lift into action. Rook b1, rook b5, and now rook h5. And the fact that white still has this other rook available to lift into kingside makes this even stronger. White just has a decisive initiative here. Again, he hasn't really done anything fancy to this point. He's already got overwhelming amounts of firepower aimed at the black king side. And look at how many of black's pieces are nowhere near the black king. Knight on c6, bishop b7, rook a8. None of those pieces are anywhere near the black king side, and they have no hope of getting to the black king side. And white's already got this huge superiority in localized firepower. The bishop on d3 is available. Knight on f3 is available. Rook on h5 is available. Notice the bishop on c1 is already developed without having moved, because it makes h6 impossible, because the bishop would just hack the pawn off. White's already got a decisive attack. So g6, knight g5, absolutely the best move. The rook on h5 is just simply taboo. Black can't take that. Rook h6 is also okay. It's not nearly the best move. So the rook's trapped, so white has to go in for this. 97, rook e8 would be poor. White has overwhelming compensation with the exchange sacrifice. Knight g4 is coming, followed by like queen f4, queen g5. And this is fantastic for white. This is still... It's no longer a decisive initiative. I would say it's close to decisive initiative, because now black has some defensive chances. He's had time to move his knight from c6 to e7 to f5, which is what you want to do when you're under attack. You want to start streaming your pieces over to defense. But knight g5, it's striking while the iron is hot. All these pieces are isolated from the black king side. There's no reason to slow down. This is the time for white to act. So knight g5 immediately just starts slamming into black's position. Bishop takes. This is more or less forced. Of course, black can't take. And white's just mating. This is over. Knight d4 is possible. But this is also mating quite quickly. Rook f8, pretty much forced. And white can simply take some time to win the black queen. And white will still have a decisive mate attack going along with this. So this is over. Knight e7 might be black's best defensive chance. But white's just up a pawn with a continuing mating attack. Simple as that. Again, it's remarkable that white doesn't have to do anything fancy. There's a couple of tactics here and there. But again, just the course of the game, white is just mobilizing faster and getting to the black king side before black can get reinforcements over there. That's it. That's all really a mating attack is all about. Just that localized superiority of firepower. And sometimes it takes a sacrifice to get that, and sometimes here, you just mobilize faster and get there faster. Rook g5. Bishop takes g5 is a little bit more accurate. That's sort of a quibble. Rook h6. Rook takes h7 doesn't work because the black queen defends the second rank, which is rook h6. And white's attack just continues. So bishop takes g5 is a little bit more accurate, but this is also fine. e7, h5. So now we played h4 earlier to support knight g5, but again, once you force g6, that h-pawn break is also there to start to tear down black's defenses. So it's completely proper for white to include that. You just start breaking the black kingside down. Knight f5, hoping to blunt this bishop off. Queen g4, again, simple development, just mobilizing against the black kingside. White doesn't have to do anything fancy here. White's just mobilizing faster than black can. Queen f6, queen d5, bishop f4. White's simply threatening rook takes g6 and bishop e5. And that would be over. So queen f6, bishop f4, just threatening bishop e5. Bishop e5 was played. Rook x e6 is a little bit more accurate. And that's a force mate. But rook, this is a quibble. Bishop e5 is perfectly fine as well. Queen h6. Notice that f6 doesn't work either. And then white removes the guardianship of the queen of g7 first, and this is over. But this is a dominating position for white, of course. The bishop on f6 is just completely destroying the position. White can just build at leisure. Okay, so yeah, I love this little timeout that white takes. Black's not even allowed to win a pawn on c3. Just c4. Just why allow counterplay when you don't have to? Knight g7. If black tries to create counterplay, just d5. And then just bishop takes f5. And the black kingside is getting cracked. So knight g7. And rook e3. And black resigned here. It's not too soon for that. This game is completely over. Notice that if not h5, rook takes h5 is a pretty cool way to end the game. And that would be checkmate. And given the strength of white's bishops in this entire game, it's entirely proper that these bishops end up being the decisive factor in this variation. So the key to the position, what I want you to take away from this, in hanging pawns, again, that I want to emphasize that d-pawn break is so often going to be a decisive element in your thinking about the hanging pawns. Generally, pawn breaks in general, what you want to be looking at, so really thinking about strategically. But there are situations when you have hanging pawns where the situation's right for just a pure piece attack. Here, there's so many of black pieces isolated from the black kingside. That's sort of your mnemonic device to start thinking about, can I go directly for a kingside attack here? The pawn on c3 perfectly defends the pawn on d4. If the white pawn were on c4, we'd have to put our counterplay hat on and think about defending this d-pawn, making sure black can't get adequate counterplay against that pawn. Here, the pawn is on c3, so the pawn on d4, we don't have to worry about it. That's sort of another mnemonic device that we can think about just going off on the black kingside. And h4 is one of those moves and patterns you want to have in your database. Even if it's a pawn sacrifice, black simply can't take. This is overwhelming compensation for the pawn. It's not even compensation, it's just winning. But even if black doesn't take that pawn, supporting that knight hopping into g5, this bishop on d3 coordinating with that knight hop to g5. Those are the attacking themes that you really want to be on the lookout for. This rook lift of rook b1, rook b5, and then rook to h5. It's a little bit unique, but the idea of rook lifts getting into the game. On the initial pawn sacrifice, that rook lifting to e3 is incredibly thematic. You see that in both isolated pawns and hanging pawns. But basically, black stayed passive the entire game, and all white was able to do was just mobilize. That's all attacking is. Getting your pieces to the point of attack far before the defender can get their pieces to the point of attack. Here, white's not doing anything fancy. He's just mobilizing quickly, getting on the attack. And all these white pieces are aimed at the black kingside at a time when so many of black's pieces have no hope of getting over there in time. That's really the long and short of this attack. White never really had to do anything fancy. But the patterns of this game, this pawn coming to h4 to support the knight g5 hop, the rook lift to support the attack, h7 being the main point of attack for really this entire game. And then that further h-pawn break against the weakened black kingside. Once you've got h4 included, h5 is always going to be a natural move to continue the attack. And then the queen lifting in with the rook lift. This is all thematic play. That's why I wanted to include this game, because basically every move of white's is just so incredibly thematic here. White could have won faster at some points, but everything here was just so thematic and natural. So, beautiful game from Schlosser. This will be our last game looking at how to handle hanging pawns. We're going to do a quick review with everything we looked at with hanging pawns, and then we'll dive into a review of how to fight against hanging pawns. So, my name is John. I'll see you then.